For over 600 years, the Ottoman Empire was this massive central pillar of world history. I mean, it was just this sprawling, incredibly complex structure that rose up, totally dominated, and then piece by piece just unraveled. So today, we're going to explore how that grand structure was built, and maybe more importantly, how it all came apart. And that's really the big question here, isn't it? How does an empire that controlled so much of the world, one that terrified and fascinated Europe for centuries, just collapse? How does it fade away into hunger and occupation and then finally just vanish from the map? That's the mystery we're really digging into. The scale of this transformation is it's wild. The Ottomans started out as just one of many small Turkic groups on the frontier, basically living by raiding. But their real genius was figuring out how to turn that violence into a system of administration. And from that, they evolved into this sophisticated global power that would literally reshape the world. So, how'd they pull it off? Well, this first phase of the empire, it wasn't about fancy bureaucracy. It was about taking that raw, pragmatic frontier violence and turning it into a repeatable, sustainable system of rule. The early expansion was just incredibly fast, but also super precarious. I mean, after they grabbed their first real capital, Bursa, they just started pushing right into Europe. But then, in 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, the whole thing almost got wiped out. It just shows you how fragile their power was at the beginning. But they survived, they rebuilt, and it all led to the ultimate prize, Constantinople in 1453. Now, the logic behind the empire's strength, this is key to its success, and it's pretty brutal. To make sure they had total loyalty, the Ottomans didn't just recruit soldiers, they basically manufactured them. The Devshirme system created this elite corps, the Janissaries, who owed their entire existence to the Sultan and the Sultan alone. It was a terrifyingly effective way to centralize power. And for the conquest of Constantinople, that power was paired with some serious cutting-edge technology. The legendary walls of that city had stood for 1,000 years, but Mehmed II brought gunpowder in a form the world had literally never seen before. This monster cannon, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a psychological tool that basically announced to the world that the old rules of warfare were over. So after Constantinople falls, the empire enters its golden age. And this wasn't just about getting bigger, it was about getting smarter. And a lot of that is thanks to one man, Suleiman the Magnificent. It's funny, while Europeans called him magnificent, the Ottomans called him Kanuni, the lawgiver. And that distinction is so important. The empire's real strength, it wasn't just in winning battles, but in its ability to create this incredibly stable administration. The Kanun was like the software that ran the entire imperial machine. It defined everything from taxes to criminal law, and it's what made the empire so predictable and durable. But no empire is infinite. When Suleiman marched on Vienna in 1529, that amazing machine kind of hit a wall. And it wasn't some single dramatic defeat. It was just the grinding reality of logistics. The army was exhausted by the time it even got there. This moment was really the first little hint that the empire's expansion couldn't just go on forever. Okay, so this is where the story gets really fascinating. The causes of the empire's decline weren't just outside threats. They were these fatal ironies coded directly into the very systems that had made the empire so powerful in the first place. And here are the core paradoxes. The very tools the Ottomans designed for stability, things like those loyal soldiers or a clear line of succession, they would, over time, begin to poison the state from the inside. Each of these strengths was eventually going to curdle into a fatal weakness. First up, the Janissaries. Remember them? Created to be the Sultan's perfect weapon, loyal only to him. But here's the thing. What happens when that weapon realizes it's completely indispensable? Well, over time, they went from being servants to a powerful political class that could literally hold the Cid hostage, demanding bonuses and even getting rid of sultans they didn't like. The solution had become the problem. And then there's the law of succession. To stop the civil wars that almost destroyed the early empire, the state formalized fratricide, the killing of royal brothers. It was a brutal but logical way to make sure there was one undisputed ruler. But the cost was huge. The palace became a hotbed of paranoia, and it often meant the most capable princes were eliminated just because they were seen as a threat. This left the throne to whoever survived the suspicion, not necessarily the best person for the job. So, with all these internal flaws just festering away, the empire began this long, slow, centuries-long process of unraveling. It wasn't a sudden collapse, but more of a grinding retreat in the face of a world that was rapidly changing around it. And if you had to pick one single year, one moment that was the definitive turning point, it's this one, 1683. This was the second and final attempt to take Vienna. And when it failed, the psychological shockwave across Europe and inside the empire itself was just profound. After the defeat at Vienna, you get the Treaty of Karlowitz. And for the very first time, the empire wasn't dictating the terms. It was forced to accept them. It had to give up huge chunks of territory in Europe. The thing is, the entire machinery of the state was built on conquest. It just didn't know how to run in reverse. By the 1800s, the need for reform was just painfully obvious. But the biggest obstacle was the Janissaries themselves. So, in the shocking act of internal violence, Sultan Mahmud II literally turned cannons on their own barracks in Istanbul. To save itself, the empire had to violently destroy one of its own founding institutions. But even this desperate attempt at reform couldn't stop the final accelerating collapse. The rise of nationalism, global wars, and internal revolution, they would finally bring the 600-year-old structure crashing down. The end came so incredibly fast. In just a few decades, nationalism stripped away the Balkan territories, while the revolution changed the government at home. Then the Balkan Wars of 1912 pushed the empire almost completely out of Europe. And then came the final gamble, joining World War I on the side of Germany, which would be the one that sealed its fate for good. The final collapse was just swift. Defeat in the war led to the Allied occupation of the capital. But out of that humiliation, a nationalist movement rose up in Anatolia, and they fought a war of independence against both foreign powers and the old imperial system. Then, in 1922, the Sultanate was abolished. It was over, and in 1923, the new Republic of Turkey was born from the ashes. So, the empire is gone, but its ghost is still with us. The lines that were drawn on the map right after its collapse, well, they created many of the states and many of the conflicts that we still see in the Middle East today. So the story isn't really over. And the final question it leaves us with is this: what parts of this 600-year legacy are we still living with and still fighting over right now?